You know that feeling, right? You want to get your head around something big, something complex, but you're just drowning in reports and articles.
Mm-hmm. It's overwhelming.
Totally. It feels impossible sometimes to just cut through it all and find out what actually matters.
Well, that's pretty much what we try to do here.
Exactly. We do the deep dive, pull out the key stuff, the surprising bits, the things that really help you understand, but, without the headache.
And today we're going really global. We're looking at the rights and situations of Indigenous peoples all around the world, specifically focusing on the year 2010.
Wow. Okay. And our main source for this?
It's the Indigenous World 2011 report. So it's a snapshot from that specific time, looking back at 2010.
And this isn't just one corner of the world. This report, it's massive in scope, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. We're talking the Arctic, Latin America, Asia, Africa, even parts of the Middle East. It's got incredible breadth.
So a huge geographical reach. And I guess that means a whole tangle of different issues.
Definitely. You see recurring themes, but in different contexts. Things like land rights, that's huge. The push for self-determination. Keeping cultures alive in a world that's changing so fast.
And the impact of, development. Resource extraction.
That's a major one, how that clashes with traditional ways of life. And then there are the legal frameworks, what protections exist, and crucially, where they fall short.
Okay, so our mission for this deep dive, dig into that 2010 picture, pull out the key insights, maybe some surprising facts, and really get a sense of the challenges, but also any progress for Indigenous communities globally back then.
That's the plan.
All right, let's jump in. Where do we start? Way up north, the Arctic.
Let's start there. Greenland is a fascinating case study right off the bat. You immediately see this push and pull between economic development, I think oil and gas exploration. Companies like Cairn Energy were very active in Indigenous rights.
Right. And who was pushing back on the right side?
Well, you had groups like the Inuit Circumpolar Council, a really important voice. They were strongly advocating for the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP.
That's the big international one, right?
Exactly. And they were questioning if Greenland's own processes, hearings, decision-making, actually respected those rights properly.
And this development, it wasn't just abstract plans, was it? There were real impacts on the ground.
Oh, definitely. Think about the influx of foreign workers. Cairn Energy alone was bringing in, something like 600 people a month through just one town.
Wow. In Greenland's context, that's a huge number. You have to wonder about the social impact, the cultural shifts.
Precisely. How does that affect local communities, resources, social structures? Big questions. And it wasn't just oil and gas causing concern.
What else?
Other big projects. A proposed aluminum smelter, various mining ventures. Organizations like Avatek, they focus on Inuit culture and environment. They were raising serious environmental red flags.
Okay, so environmental concerns were a big part of the picture, too.
Absolutely. And Avatek was active in the public debate. The national radio, KNR, was apparently giving more airtime to questions about whether the environmental impact studies were really thorough enough.
It often goes hand in hand, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Indigenous rights and environmental protection.
Very often. But it wasn't a completely unified view within Greenland, was it? I remember reading something about Greenpeace.
Ah, yes. That's interesting. When Greenpeace protested Cairn Energy's drilling?
They didn't get a lot of local support.
Really? Why do you think that was?
Well, it suggests that some Greenlanders perhaps saw the resource development as, a genuine path to maybe economic improvement, creating jobs. So there was this tension within the community, too.
That makes it even more complex. And all of this is happening against the backdrop of climate change.
Undeniably, you can't talk about the Arctic without talking about climate change. The ice sheet melt, the unpredictable sea ice, it directly hits traditional Inuit life, hunting, travel, everything.
A stark reality. Okay, so let's shift focus a bit, still in the Arctic region, but eastward. The Sami people.
Right. Their traditional territory, Sapmi, stretches across northern Sweden, Norway, and Finland.
And they have distinct traditions, like reindeer herding.
Reindeer herding, fishing, hunting, gathering, all deeply important to Sami culture and identity.
And they have political structures, too. Sami parliaments.
Yes, in each of those three countries. And these aren't just talking shops. They play a real role advocating for Sami interests within the national systems. They have the same rights as other citizens, but these parliaments focus specifically on Sami issues, culture, politics, land.
Were there any specific legal changes for the Sami around 2010?
In Sweden, yes, a new Sami language act came into force that year.
What did it do?
It basically widened the areas where Sami languages could be used in official contexts, dealing with authorities, that kind of thing. A good step for language preservation.
Okay, that sounds positive. But were there still unresolved issues?
Oh, definitely. That new reindeer herding agreement between Sweden and Norway, signed the year before, was still controversial. Sami groups had concerns about pasture lands, and it hadn't been ratified yet in 2010.
And land rights cases.
Yes, there was a case brought by a Swedish Sami individual to the European Court of Human Rights. So the legal struggles over traditional territories continued.
So a mixed bag in Scandinavia, some progress, but ongoing fights. How did things look further east in Russia? Their stance on UNDRIP was different, wasn't it?
Very different. Russia abstained from endorsing the UN declaration. That says a lot.
And didn't their own indigenous Congress make proposals that were ignored?
That's right. The Sixth Congress of Indigenous Small-Numbered Peoples put forward recommendations in 2009 to improve representation and address their needs, but crickets. No official response from the government.
And the reports on their actual living conditions.
Frankly, dire. We're talking about communities in the north, Siberia, the Far East.
Right.
Their traditional resources were being commercialized. Services like schools and hospitals were closing down.
Leading to
Food insecurity, sickness, even high suicide rates reported. It points to really profound marginalization, a deep disconnect between the state and these communities.
That sounds incredibly tough. Were there specific examples of how policies affected them day to day? Fishing rights, maybe?
Yes, the fishing regulations in the Khabarovsk region are a shocking example. The authorities set catch limits per person that were way, way below what anyone needed for a traditional lifestyle.
So not enough fish allowed, basically.
Not nearly enough. And on top of that, they created this incredibly bureaucratic permit system. Getting permission to fish legally, even for your own family's food, became almost impossible for most indigenous people there.
So what happens then?
The report says it basically forced people into poaching just to survive. And then they risk fines, having their boats or nets confiscated, vital equipment.
It's a classic case of regulations completely missing the mark. Or worse, actively undermining people's basic needs and traditional practices. What about big development projects like pipelines?
Another major point of conflict, the planned East Siberia Pacific gas pipeline. Gazprom, the state energy giant, wanted a new route.
And that route
Went right through the traditional lands of the Evenk people in Yakutia. And not just their lands, but through a nature reserve, too.
Did the Evening people try to stop it?
They appealed directly to President Medvedev, to Gazprom, explaining the devastating impact it would have on their livelihoods, on the environment. It seemed the route was chosen mainly to cut construction costs.
So across the Arctic Greenland, Russia, this pattern emerges. Resource extraction versus indigenous rights and well-being.
It's a very consistent theme, but there were some more positive notes further west in Nunatsiavut, Labrador.
Yes, the Inuit self-governing region. What was happening there?
They held elections for their new government, officially opened a new administration center. Concrete steps in self-governance.
It's something about repatriation.
Yes, a really significant moment. The announcement that Inuit remains held by the Field Museum in Chicago would be repatriated. Hugely important culturally and spiritually.
Okay, let's move south now. North America, Canada first. They endorsed UNDRP in 2010, right? But there was a catch.
There was a big one. They endorsed it, which was noted, but they explicitly said they interpreted it only in ways that were consistent with Canada's existing constitution and legal framework.
So not a full, unqualified embrace.
Exactly. Indigenous groups and others had pushed for an unqualified endorsement. So this conditionality, it raised doubts about how committed the government really was to the Declaration's core principles. It felt like existing Canadian law still took precedence.
And the courts in Canada, they still seem to be hammering out the details of the Crown's duty to consult with Aboriginal peoples.
Absolutely. Court cases were ongoing, constantly refining what that duty means, especially when treaty rights or traditional lands are affected by development or government actions.
Any key precedents mentioned?
The Haida Nation case is still key, the idea that for really serious impacts you need full consent. But the report also points out situations like with the Barrier Lake Algonquin First Nation.
What happened there?
A lack of meaningful consultation over resource development on their lands. So the legal principles are there, but the application on the ground, maybe not always consistent.
Okay, let's cross the border. The U.S. 2010 saw the Claims Resolution Act. What was that about?
It was legislation to finalize several major settlements addressing long-standing historical grievances.
Like what?
The Cobell settlement that dealt with decades of government mismanagement of trust accounts belonging to individual Native Americans. Huge case.
Okay, what else?
The Keepseagle settlement for American Indian farmers who faced discrimination in loans, and also several big water rights settlements for various pueblos and tribes trying to resolve decades-long disputes over water resources.
So, attempts to settle historical wrongs.
Mm-hmm.
But how were these settlements received? Were they seen as fair?
That's the crucial point. While they provided some money, often in very impoverished communities, many Indigenous people felt it was just a fraction of what was truly owed.
So not really justice.
That was the critique. The outgoing chairman of the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe put it, well, some needed money, but it didn't represent true justice or full reparations for the scale of the historical wrongs. Similar feelings about the water settlements often getting less water than their legal rights suggested.
It's that tension, some resolution versus full justice. What about energy in the U.S. context?
An interesting mix. You saw growing interest in wind energy among Native nations, especially on the Great Plains, a move towards renewables and energy independence.
But the older industries were still dominant in some areas.
Definitely. In the Southwest, particularly the Navajo Nation, coal mining was still a major employer. The Four Corners Power Plant, a huge polluter, got an EPA order for better pollution controls, but it was still expected to keep running, maybe even expand output.
And the coal for that plant came from the Navajo mine. Was there controversy there too?
Yes, a federal judge actually blocked a permit for a big expansion of that mine. The environmental impact study was found inadequate. A key problem was the lack of proper public notice and consultation, crucially, not provided properly in both English and Navajo.
Highlighting the work of local groups.
Exactly. Groups like Decare Dine Citizens, against ruining our environment, were actively fighting for environmental protection and meaningful consultation. It's that persistent clash, economic needs versus environmental and cultural protection.
Let's head further south now, into Mexico and Central America. The report seemed critical of Mexico's national development planning regarding indigenous peoples.
It did raise some questions, both about the government's own national development plan and even a UN Development Program report on indigenous human development.
What were the criticisms?
Things like weak methodology, maybe not enough real fieldwork connecting with communities on the ground, and perhaps too narrow a view of what indigenous development actually means, not fully capturing the diversity. Basically, a concern that these top-level plans might not reflect reality or needs.
And the situation described in San Juan Copala, Oaxaca. That sounded just horrific.
It was devastating. A community trying to achieve autonomy faced a prolonged paramilitary siege by rival groups. Blockades, violence.
And assassinations.
Tragically, yes. Alberta Carreño Trujillo, a human rights defender, and Jerry Jacola, an international observer, were murdered during a humanitarian convoy trying to break the siege. And even after that, killings of community leaders continued.
Did international bodies respond?
The UN Special Rapporteurs condemned it strongly, called for government protection. But the violence persisted. It just shows the extreme danger faced by indigenous people asserting their rights and autonomy in some regions, a real lack of security and justice.
Chilling. Elsewhere in the region, Guatemala had issues with the official registry of people.
Yes, RENAP, the National Registry. There were cases reported where indigenous people trying to get or renew their ID cards were just unilaterally reclassified as Ladinos non-indigenous.
Who protested this?
The Xinca parliament denounced it, and complaints came from Ayaquiche representatives too. It suggests a systemic problem within state institutions undermining indigenous identity recognition.
And behind some of these pressures, extractive industries.
That's a clear thread. The economic clout of mining and logging companies often seems to influence authorities, overshadowing indigenous rights. But communities are fighting back.
Wow.
Documenting their own community consultations, pushing to make these processes official, using tools like ILO Convention 169 and UNDRIP to demand their right to be consulted before projects go ahead.
Okay, Nicaragua next. New laws there raised alarms.
Two in particular, one on coastal development and another, the law on the legal border regime. That second one was especially worrying.
Right.
It gave the Nicaraguan army significant power over resource management and development in border areas, and many indigenous territories are in those border zones, even ones recently recognized. It potentially overrides indigenous control over their own resources.
But wasn't there a process for titling indigenous lands?
There was, Canadeti. Some progress was made, some territories got titles, but many others were stuck in conflict with settlers, and the commission seemed to lack the political will, or maybe the resources, to really resolve these conflicts effectively.
So the process stalled.
Pretty much. The government talked about a broader coexistence policy, but basically kicked the can down the road waiting for elections. It left indigenous authorities to try and sort out these complex land issues themselves with very limited funds.
Doesn't sound much better in Costa Rica. A draft law on indigenous autonomy just ignored.
Yeah, the lack of political will seemed quite stark there. That bill just sat in the legislature. And worse, the National Development Plan for 2011-2014 seemed to completely ignore indigenous rights and ethnic diversity.
How so?
It used outdated language like reserves, planned investments on indigenous lands without any consultation, just disregarded their existence almost.
And the big hydroelectric project, Eldicus.
A perfect example. The largest hydro project in Central America at the time, planned right in an area with huge biodiversity and the ancestral lands of several indigenous peoples, Tirib, Cabekar, Brinca, Bribri.
And consultation.
Hadn't even started, despite it being legally required. It just looked like large-scale development was being prioritized over indigenous rights and basic dialogue.
All right, let's move into South America. Colombia. 2010 was the end of the Uribe era, right? Did the change bring hope?
Some initial positive signs, yes. The Constitutional Court had already been acting as a check on presidential power. The new president, Juan Manuel Santos, made some gestures public acknowledgement, inviting indigenous reps to discussions on the National Development Plan. His focus on poverty, democratic prosperity, sounded promising initially.
But the core problems remained. Mining, oil.
Absolutely. The negative impacts of mining, both legal and illegal, on indigenous territories and the environment were ongoing concerns. Plus, the low royalties the state got from oil companies and the potential for mining to just make inequality worse.
Did Santos engage evenly with all indigenous groups?
It seemed selective. He attended the Embera Congress, but skipped the larger Congress of the Peoples, which included many different social groups. Some saw that as a strategic choice, maybe engaging with some while sidelining others.
And the Mario Vargas Llosa situation, winning the Nobel Prize while also criticizing contemporary indigenous movements.
Yeah, that was a fascinating contradiction, wasn't it? He won for a novel exposing historical atrocities against indigenous people in Putumayo. Amazing work. He was publicly critical of modern indigenous groups opposing resource extraction, sometimes using really harsh language, comparing them to terrorists in some articles. It really shows the complex, sometimes conflicting views people hold about indigenous rights and development.
Moving over to Venezuela. Strong constitutional recognition of indigenous rights, but the reality.
The reality, especially for the Yucpa people, was a continued struggle. They were trying to get back ancestral lands taken over by cattle ranches and mining.
Did the government help?
They issued some land titles, but often for fragmented areas, not the whole territory. Some Yucpa leaders rejected this, pushing for self-demarcation of their entire ancestral land base, a gap between state recognition and indigenous demands for full control.
And surname. Lack of legal recognition seems key there.
Very much so. Without clear legal status for their collective land and resource rights, indigenous and tribal Maroon peoples were really vulnerable. Threats from more mining, big infrastructure projects like roads, and government plans to sort of absorb traditional authorities into state structures, potentially undermining their autonomy.
Ecuador saw growing tensions between the government and CONAIO, the main indigenous organization.
Yeah, the relationship really soured in 2010. Big disagreements over laws, especially the draft water law. CONAIO felt it didn't protect indigenous rights and water management practices.
And this led to protests.
Yes. CONAIO was excluded from an ALBA summit, which fueled anger. There were widespread protests, accusations of racism, government repression. Plus, other indigenous groups emerged with different views, showing a more complex political landscape.
Peru's decision not to enact the prior consultation law sounds like a major setback.
A huge blow. That law was seen as essential for implementing ILO 169 properly, the requirement to consult indigenous peoples on things affecting them.
So why didn't they enact it after Congress approved it?
The government reversed course. That, combined with worries about repressive measures, human rights violations like a decree giving security forces a kind of amnesty for past abuses, painted a really concerning picture for indigenous rights in Peru.
Bolivia, with an indigenous president, Evo Morales.
Mm-hmm.
How were things there? More representation,
There was definitely more direct indigenous representation in local and departmental elections, which was significant. Morales' MAS party had a majority.
But challenges with autonomy.
Yes. The new laws on autonomy and jurisdictional demarcation faced a lot of criticism from indigenous organizations. They felt their input wasn't properly considered, and the laws limited the scope of autonomy and the recognition of traditional justice systems.
Okay, quickly touching on others. Brazil, slow land demarcation despite Lula. Paraguay, the IWGIA land claim highlighting state discrimination.
Yes, in Brazil, land titling was frustratingly slow, funds weren't being fully used. In Paraguay, the IWGIA case by the Inter-American Court really exposed the state's difficult stance on ancestral land claims. That led to the formation of MCOI-PAIPAI, a coordinating body for indigenous land rights struggles there.
Argentina saw more mobilization. Chile ratified ILO-169, but faced earthquake impacts and issues on Rapa Nui.
Right. Argentina. More protests demanding land back, prior consent, and the application of the law suspending evictions. Concerns also about the census methodology for identifying indigenous people. Chile. ILO 169 ratification was good, but the earthquake hit indigenous communities hard, worsening poverty. And on Rapa Nui, Easter Island, ongoing tensions over land ownership, reports of police violence.
Okay, let's pivot to Asia, New Zealand. Maria's concerns about mining.
Yes, mining interests were a big issue. Even though some controversial plans on conservation land were shelved due to public outcry, the Waitangi Tribunal issued a critical report.
About what?
It found the government's way of managing petroleum resources breached treaty principles by not properly considering Maori interests. But the government didn't always follow tribunal findings historically, so there were doubts about whether this report would lead to real change.
Elsewhere in the Pacific, Guam, Guam.
The Chamorro people still lacked full voting representation in the U.S. Congress, and disappointment over cuts to war reparations continued.
Japan. The Ainu struggle against that waste facility.
The Monbetsu Ainu were fighting hard against an industrial waste facility planned on their ancestral land near the Mopet River. They explicitly used UNDIPRIA in their arguments.
Did it work?
Unfortunately, the permit was issued anyway. They were considering legal action. It really highlights the ongoing fight for land rights against development pressures.
China's policies in Xinjiang and Tibet sound concerning from a cultural rights perspective.
Yes, the ethnic unity push in Xinjiang, through things like education rules, seemed to prioritize national unity over real cultural autonomy, restricting dissent. In Tibet, the UN Special Rapporteur flagged concerns about forced resettlement of nomads and lack of consultation on development projects, a very top-down approach.
Taiwan has laws protecting indigenous rights, but challenges remain.
Definitely. Despite the laws, issues like disappearing cultures and languages, lower social status, limited political clout were still very real in 2010. Not enough indigenous teachers was another specific problem hindering language revitalization.
The Philippines has the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, but implementation is the key issue.
Exactly. IPRA is significant legislation on paper, but making it work effectively on the ground has been a constant struggle. It leaves communities vulnerable to development aggression projects like mining or logging that steamroll their rights and consent.
Indonesia, large indigenous population, limited national recognition, but some regional progress. Malaysia, recognized customary rights, but poor implementation. Thailand, initiatives for the Karen, but concerns about climate change planning participation.
That sums it up well. Indonesia, lots of people, but patchy legal recognition nationally, though some positive regional laws. Malaysia, native customary rights exist legally, but aren't always enforced well, though some positive court cases in Sarawak, Thailand. Government efforts for the Karen, but indigenous groups felt left out of drafting the National Climate Change Plan.
And hydropower dams seemed a major issue in Cambodia and Laos. Burma, Myanmar saw continued oppression. Bangladesh, Chittagong Hill tracks issues. Nepal is controversies and rights violations. India, Forest Rights Act implementation issues, and Naga talks. It's a complex picture across Asia.
It really is. You see this constant struggle against development pressures, the gap between laws and reality, and the fight to maintain cultural identity and land rights across hugely diverse communities.
Okay, final continent, Africa. Let's start with Palestine, the Jahalan Bedouin.
Facing a really precarious situation in Area C of the West Bank. Real threats of mass eviction, their villages often not recognized by Israeli authorities, leaving them incredibly vulnerable.
North and West Africa. Amazi advocacy in Morocco and Algeria. Pool pastoralists in Burkina Faso. Tuareg in Mali?
Yes, the Amazi cultural movement kept pushing for rights in Morocco. Algeria had constitutional recognition for Tamzite language and identity, but practical implementation lagged. The Pool pastoralists faced challenges to their nomadic life from population growth, and the Tuareg in Mali were caught up in the instability caused by AQMI and drug trafficking.
Horn in East Africa, Ethiopia leasing pastoral lands, Kenya's new constitution but UNDRIP abstention, Uganda, Tanzania, pastoral land pressures.
Ethiopia's policy of leasing ancestral pastoral lands to foreign investors caused huge disruption, confiscations, even violence. Kenya's new constitution was promising for marginalized groups, but they abstained on UNDRIP. And the Ogiek in the Mau Forest still faced eviction threats despite conservation roles. And yes, pastoral lands in Uganda and Tanzania were under increasing pressure from government, mining, and investors.
Central Africa. Rwanda's reluctance on specific Batwa laws. DRC pygmies displaced by logging conservation. Gabon's grassroots efforts.
Rwanda's policy was cautious about ethnic identification and law affecting specific Batwa protections, though some progress in education health. In DRC, pygmy communities, heavily forest-dependent, were displaced by both logging and conservation projects, often worsening their situation. Gabon showed positive signs with indigenous-led capacity building and mapping.
And Southern Africa. Namibia's sand conservancies. WIMS's advocacy. South Africa's delayed Sarah Bartman Center.
Namibia showed contrasts for the sand depending on land type, with conservancies offering some potential. WIMSA was vital regionally advocating for sand and other groups. And yes, frustrating delays continued for the Sarah Bartman Center of Remembrance in South Africa.
Okay, finally, let's briefly touch on the international stage in 2010, the UN Permanent Forum.
Its session focused on development with culture and identity, really emphasizing that development shouldn't erase culture and indigenous people must participate. They also had a key session on indigenous peoples and forests tackling displacement by conservation and the right to manage their own lands.
The special rapporteur, James Anaya.
Very active, responding to violations, doing country visits, thematic studies, promoting good practices. His mandate was renewed too, showing the ongoing need for that role.
Other key processes, UPR, Nagoya Protocol, Arctic Council.
The UPR at the Human Rights Council kept reviewing countries, including indigenous rights issues. The International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, IFB, was heavily involved in the Nagoya Protocol talks on genetic resources, pushing hard for free, prior informed consent, and respect for customary law. And the Arctic Council was strengthening, with a focus on maintaining the role of indigenous permanent participants as global interest in the Arctic grew.
So, lots happening at the international level, too, trying to set standards.
Definitely. Growing recognition, ongoing efforts to build frameworks. But as the IIFB's concerns about Nagoya showed, constant vigilance and active indigenous participation are crucial to make these frameworks meaningful on the ground.
Wow. Okay. That was a huge sweep across the globe for 2010. This deep dive, it really has just skimmed the surface of that Indigenous World 2011 report, hasn't it?
It really has. It's incredibly detailed. But even from this overview, some really strong themes just jump out, don't they?
Absolutely. That constant tension, that clash between economic development and indigenous rights seems almost universal.
And the ongoing struggle for land, for self-determination, it's everywhere. Plus, the importance, even if inconsistently applied, of those international standards like UNDRIP.
And we heard about so many setbacks and challenges, but it's important not to forget the resilience, the activism.
Exactly. The progress made by communities themselves, fighting for their rights, their cultures, their futures. It's not just a story of victimhood.
Which really leaves us, and you listening, with a big question, doesn't it?
I think so. When you see how interconnected all these issues are globally, what's our collective responsibility as individuals, as nations? How do we ensure indigenous rights and well-being are central to building a future that's actually just and sustainable for everyone?
That's definitely something to chew on. We really do encourage you, if this sparked your interest, to look up the Indigenous World 2011 report. Find out more about the specific places or issues that caught your attention. There's so much more to learn.